down to our last 10 works in the curriculum. We're getting into the late 20th and early 21st century, so a period that and paradigm that you're all pretty familiar with. That familiarity might be a bit questionable when you see a piece like this. I don't really understand why it's in the AP curriculum either. I don't think of it as a particularly technically advanced work, especially even just for this artist. So nevertheless, we're going to walk our way through it. So this is a large-scale drawing, around 88 by 73 inches. So the figure is about life size, if not a little bit larger. So a couple of common themes of Kiki Smith's work are featured in this piece. One of the themes that is constantly reoccurring in her work is this theme of the female body. A lot of Smith's pieces focus on the vulnerability of bodies and women's bodies in particular. There's also this theme of like the familiarity and comfort or discomfort in one's own body that is emerging pretty frequently. There's also this narrated mythology, particularly for Kiki Smith, Western European mythology. So you've probably all heard of the narrative story of Little Red Riding Hood, this young girl that basically overcomes like a sinister natural power. There's also this mythology of Saint Genevieve, the patron saint of Paris, who was known for her relationship with animals as well as her ability to tame wolves. So a lot of these mythologies that Kiki Smith is referencing in her work are fragmented and they borrow influences from one another. There's kind of like these collections of narratives that are coming together to create these kind of like collage together narratives that are appearing in her work. So there's also this relationship with animals that is being depicted here, not only in the reference to Saint Genevieve, but with the figure of this wolf in the center of the image. Both of the figures are relatively calm. The woman appears to have tamed the wolf by embracing it. And there's this kind of like interconnectedness of the figures that is being suggested here. What's also interesting is that this figure, or these figures together, are not really in a natural setting, which kind of as viewers gets us to focus on just the figures themselves and their relationship rather than their relationship with an environment. So the connection here that is being suggested is more of a connection between the figures than to outside forces. Every time I look at this painting, I'm just reminded of the way that I drew hands when I was in 7th grade. I'm sure that everybody in VA can identify with this in some way. Interesting times. So here's a couple of other pieces of Kiki Smith. She is a multimedia installation artist. She's done these kinds of like tapestry-like pieces more recently, but I also really love her sculptural work. I love the play that is being suggested here in the name, this kind of like double entendre, like this figure's name might be Daisy, and then there's chains, and there's like the concept of a daisy chain. So if you're interested in seeing other works of Kiki Smith's, just be advised that some of the work is potentially triggering. Moving on to our next artist, Kara Walker. So Kara Walker has gained fame and notoriety recently for having her work featured in the Tate Turbine Hall. I'll get to that in just a moment. A lot of her earlier work is particularly recognizable for their use of these silhouetted figures. So Kara Walker is an African-American artist, and she oftentimes uses her artwork to confront and challenge stereotypes about African-Americans and the history of Africans and African-Americans in the United States. So she's also confronting these kind of like archetypal images that frequently appear when the history of African Americans are talked about. You've probably seen the Brooks slave ship diagram, that kind of cross-section of the ship of all of the enslaved people kind of like packed together in the hull of this ship. There's also kind of like these cultural figures like Pickaninnies and Aunt Jemima that are being used in these kinds of images. So a lot of Walker's work is derived from documents that were created during the Civil War era of these kind of incomplete histories. So for example, there were stories that would say like, woman lynched in this county in this state. And they would report the lynching and like where it was, but they wouldn't give the name of the person that was actually lynched. The only detail that they would give was that she was African American. So this notion of anonymity and of incomplete history is certainly referenced in the use of these silhouetted figures. There's some information that's being provided, but at the same time it's incomplete. There's suggestions of a history. There's suggestions, especially of things like atrocities. We have this colonial ship sail and this figure that is being tied to the ship. There's this kind of like image of infanticide here. There's figures that have their limbs missing and bones protruding from their hips. So there's these kind of like horrifying things that are happening, but they're kind of sanitized in the fact that they're made into these silhouettes. So these figures are created using cut paper, which are then glued to the wall. What's super interesting is that this piece also incorporates these projected images. They're very abstract in nature, typically involving colors. And when the audience is actually in this installation, they become a part of it because their silhouettes are then projected onto the wall. So there's this element of like happenings that is being incorporated here, and that the audience is not like a separate entity from the art. They are becoming a part of the art itself. So in that sense, the viewer is becoming a part of the history. So rather than depicting a single incident or event in this piece, Walker is attempting to depict the horrors of like a colonial era just in one piece. So again, we have like elements of infanticide. We have these like white figures that are dangling things in front of children. We have this procession of figures here. So there's just lots of different elements of this era that are being depicted in this work. Here's a couple of other examples of Kara Walker's pieces. I always find it interesting that she is using the arrangements of these figures to suggest kind of like this element of a dichotomy between black and white. Again, like because her work confronts potentially triggering topics, I highly advise that you exercise caution if you are curious and want to see other examples of her work. So this is the piece that was displayed in the Tate Turbine Hall actually up until April of this year. It's called Fons Americanus, and it's actually based off of a statue that's in front of Buckingham Palace in London. So again, this like colonial power that is creating this memorial to a colonial ruler. So rather than being a celebration of the British Empire, this fountain is exploring the histories of Africa, America, and Europe. So the installation was up until just relatively recently. What I love about Kara Walker, among the other things, is the fact that she's very environmentally conscious in her work. A lot of times installations are particularly wasteful in the materials and like the volume of things that they're using, and she really makes an effort to make things sustainable. This is a really cool interview that Kara Walker did with San Francisco Museum of Modern Art a couple of years ago, where she talks about this uneasy relationship with her imagination. It's definitely worth a listen to kind of get into her head and like why she does these sorts of artworks. Another work that I placed within this series that because they talk about like the legacy of colonialization and how that is affecting people of color in the modern era is the swing. So you've probably recognized the imagery of this piece from the Fragonard piece that we covered in the later Europe and Colonial Americas unit, the Rococo artwork. So Shonibare was actually born in London and then raised in Nigeria for most of his life. He then moved back to London to finish high school and then attend art school. So in this piece, you're seeing a recreation of this classic Rococo painting as a part of his critique on colonial society at large. So you probably noticed that it's a relatively simplified version of this image, not in that it's any less intricate or detailed, but that you're not seeing these two male figures that are contributing to the narrative. The one that is pushing the swing, that is supposedly the person that she's supposed to be involved with, and the man that's hidden in the bushes that is looking up her skirt. So the audience instead is taking the place of these two figures here. So there's definitely these questions of excess morality and class that are brought up in light of French aristocracy and the subsequent challenging of those standards during the French Revolution. And a lot of these questions are revisited from a contemporary perspective, particularly with regard to things like class disparity, this difference between the rich and poor, this notion of xenophobia, which is a fear of foreigners, and nationalism, which is kind of like unchecked national pride. You'll notice that the figure is headless, so we're kind of getting that element of like the coquettishness of the figure like not in there as much. It's a little bit more kind of like, I suppose, kind of like anatomical and more of like a study. You're not seeing the expression of the figure's face on here. So that's kind of taking the narrative away in a sense and having us focus more on the kinds of materials that are being used to create this piece. You'll notice that the fabrics of this artwork are not the same kinds that we see in the classic Rococo painting. So these are actually Dutch wax fabrics. So Dutch wax fabrics were, as their name suggests, these fabrics that were mass-produced by the Dutch, and they actually intended to sell them to Indonesian audiences. So they incorporated a lot of these designs and colors that they thought would appeal to Indonesian audiences, but they didn't end up selling very well. So what they did instead is that they marketed them towards West African colonies, and these communities in West Africa pretty readily took them up. So the spurious origins of these fabric add an additional meaning to Shonibare's work. This notion that like these kinds of fabrics have kind of been accepted in the modern era as like authentically African, but they actually kind of have like different origins. And there's also this notion of like these kinds of images and textiles and like cultural elements that have been incorporated into stereotypes of African people, particularly in the greater diaspora. So we also have this notion of like leisure and play that is being experienced by members of the upper echelons of society that are made possible by the exploitation of members of the lower classes. So none of these people could be enjoying this very like frivolous scene without like basically working off the backs of people of the working class. Like some artisan had to make this dress. There's a notion that like she probably has like an entire host of servants that are getting her ready every morning, and you're not seeing those people as much in these artworks. So a lot of Yinka Shonibare's artwork from this era takes on a pretty similar aesthetic. We have these wooden figures that are mostly headless, that are dressed in like period clothes, typically from Western traditions that are engaging in different activities. We have the swing, and then we also have this kind of like image of violence and kind of premonition. The figures' heads are already gone, even though they're kind of engaging in this height of action. I thought that this piece was particularly interesting in that it was called The Scramble for Africa, which was, as you'll recall, this moment in history when a bunch of Western powers were basically trying to crawl over each other to colonize parts of Africa to gain access to their resources. So we have kind of like this negotiation table. Everybody's kind of like figuring out like who gets what. So Inka Shonibare is not only an artist of color, but he's also an artist with a disability. So when he was in his earlier stages of art school, he actually ended up having a stroke. Or not a stroke, he had a viral infection in his spine, so his mobility is somewhat limited. So he actually has a team of artists that he works with to create a lot of his larger scale artworks. But I really love how in this video he's talking about how like you kind of like relearn how to do things after recovering from an illness like this, and that it's kind of providing you with an opportunity to kind of like look at the world in a different way. So it's really interesting to hear him speak too about kind of like his experience in art school, talking about how one of his teachers was like, yeah, you're doing some artwork that's critiquing Russian history, but why don't you talk about African history because you're African? So he was kind of like confronting this notion of kind of like from this microaggression that he's experiencing in school, he's creating this entire like series of extremely well-known artworks that is talking about like his relationship with African history. Our final piece of the day is Old Man's Cloth by Anatsui. So Anatsui came of age during the decolonization movement in Ghana, which you'll recall is in Western Africa, and these kind of like associated cultural renaissances that were happening in these areas after decolonization, so in the 60s and 70s. So one of these movements was the Sankofa movement, which was this movement that was really seeking to emulate Africa's rich artistic and cultural traditions, and while combining them with modern aspects of society. So you're kind of like bringing tradition into the kind of like the new paradigms. So these pieces, as you could probably tell by the titles of the works, are considered textiles. So they're created by cutting these metal foil that surrounds liquor bottles into these rectangular pieces, piercing them, and then linking them together with jump rings. So they actually do have movement to them. They're not these like static works that are stiff and then intended to like retain a certain shape. They actually do have a lot of mobility to them, and then when Anatsui actually ships them off to galleries, he says you can hang them in whatever way looks cool. So they take on different forms and shapes depending on like who installs them and where they're installed. So the artist works in Nigeria, and he actually collected the 1,000 bottle caps he needed for this project from his distillery in Nigeria. So Anatsui sees the alcohol industry as a part of the of African history, and that alcohol was a part of the transatlantic slave trade. Rum, in particular, was produced in the Caribbean and then shipped to different parts of the world, particularly in Europe, and then as well as the eastern and southern United States. So the gold color of the bottle caps is also referring to the colonialism that was happening in Ghana as a result of the scramble for Africa. Ghana and other nations in West Africa have unnaturally high deposits of gold, which is why you see gold in a lot of kinds of like more historical artworks from this region. Textiles are also a traditional part of a traditional form of art from Ghana, as well as many other parts of Western Africa. So again, we're seeing this reference to the Sankofa movement, this old form of art that is being created using new materials. So when you look at other works from Anatsui's portfolio, you see a lot of themes that link back to this notion of history particularly of the people of West Africa. Transit could, of course, be referencing the transatlantic slave trade and the movement of goods and people across these distances. We also have this word diaspora, which we see a lot in contemporary contexts. A diaspora is basically a distribution of people that all have a common origin or a common culture, but they're spread across the world in different places as a result of things like colonialism or refugees, etc.